Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to the George Washington University. I'm Lynn Goldman. I'm Dean of the School of Public Health and Health Services, and I'm delighted that all of you have decided to join us for what will be an informative and lively discussion. And I should also say, Happy Valentine's Day. I want to thank our speakers, Jeanne Rizzo, Florence Williams, Linda Birnbaum, and Conn Nugent, and our audience for coming to George Washington University for this very important conversation about breast cancer and breast cancer prevention. Today, we'll first hear from Jeanne Rizzo, the president and CEO of the Breast Cancer Fund, about a groundbreaking new report recommending a federal strategy for breast cancer prevention. While advances in detection and treatment are incredibly important in public health, we like to emphasize prevention. And in order to prevent breast cancer, we first need to understand what causes breast cancer, why it is that so many women and increasing rates of women develop breast cancer in the US and globally. I think that this new report is a bold and exciting new approach to breast cancer prevention that has a very strong scientific basis, and I'm going to be very excited about hearing all about it. In my own career, I've been quite concerned about chemicals, and particularly chemicals that have the potential for endocrine disrupting activity. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, especially environmental estrogens, are found in many household products in our daily lives, like cosmetics and soaps, polymers, lotions, even cleaning agents. And there's mounting evidence that these actually have an effect on our health. We have evidence that girls are entering puberty at younger and younger ages. Why might this be important? When you have puberty at a younger age, that in itself is a risk for breast cancer. There's also evidence that some of these endocrine disrupting chemicals may be so-called obesogens, may be contributing to overweight. Why is that important? Because when we have more body fat, that also alters us metabolically, increases our risk for breast cancer. So whether through direct means, like through in being an environmental estrogen, or indirect means, there's reason for concern that exposure to low levels of endocrine disrupting chemicals might trigger breast cancer. Many years back, when I was at the EPA, in the late 1990s, we developed approaches to try to identify and to control environmental endocrine disruptors, including estrogens, but progress has been very slow in achieving that kind of control. But I think today we have new hope that we can increase our understanding about the mechanisms and timing of exposures to chemicals and the risk of breast cancer. In short, if we can understand how chemicals may be contributing to breast cancer risk, we have a much better chance of being able to reduce those exposures and actually reduce the rates of breast cancer in men and women both. Well, my introduction here would not be complete without acknowledging the very important work of the GW Breast Cancer Imaging Center and its director, Dr. Rachel Brim. I saw Rachel here somewhere. Hi. Rachel is a passionate advocate for women with breast cancer. One of the things that I think has been so important that she's been involved with is taking the GW Mammo van out into the community in Washington, D.C., and providing screening and follow-up for women who otherwise couldn't afford it, and so that they can have really the highest quality access to patient services that anybody has anywhere. She's also a researcher, and I'm very impressed with her research to develop new methods to detect breast cancer, particularly the automated breast ultrasound, which is a very cool device. I've seen it, and it's very wonderful research. We have many other efforts going on here at GW, ranging from efforts to increase the acceptability and availability of breastfeeding for the women who work here, make this more of a baby-friendly university, to efforts to actually do research on endocrine disrupting chemicals done by Melissa Perry, who I think is here somewhere, Kim Robian, who's on our faculty, and other members of the School of Public Health faculty. But I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today's forum, Frank Sesno. Frank is the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Many of you know Frank as an Emmy Award-winning journalist and a former CNN correspondent. I know him as a friend of the environment and also a friend of public health. Frank is a creator and host of Planet Forward. He's chief executive of the Face the Facts USA, a new multi-platform effort to elevate national debate on key issues. Please join me in welcoming Frank Sesno.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, and welcome to all of you. Also, happy Valentine's Day. Here at the George Washington University. This is the building in which the School of Media and Public Affairs is based. For those of you who may not be familiar, the School of Media and Public Affairs is about 50% journalism, mass communication, and half political communication. Those are our two undergraduate majors. Fundamentally, we are about storytelling, preferably accurate storytelling. Everybody who you will hear from today has and is a great story. This issue that we will address today is a phenomenally important story. Connecting it with the public and with policymakers effectively and persuasively is not only a good and important story, it is critical for the policy making and decision making and resource allocating that lies ahead, and that's what's so important about it. A few years ago, I did an hour-long special for public television called Cancer Cures. And as I was mentioning to Conn before we came out here, we had a raging debate about whether we should even use the word cures appended to the word cancer. The most sobering moment of the program for me, and there were many, but there were also very many uplifting moments as we looked at some of the science and the research and the medicine and the socialization around this issue, was the opening of the program that probably in retrospect I shouldn't have done because it was rather somber. But it was true, and I wanted to grab the audience, that we lose in this country as many people in a year, every year, as we lost in all of World War II. Year in and year out, year in and year out. And we're great with slogans. The war on cancer, race for the cure. But the war on cancer, you know, you win, presumably you win wars, and then they're over. And the race ends at the finish line, and then you line up for the next one. And this is something altogether different, much more sustained. In that program, we had an opportunity to talk about prevention, and it was almost an odd fit in the rest of the program. But there is more to prevention, as we all know, which is why you're all here, and what you're going to hear about today, than we commonly believe. Now, I think today is going to be great, and I'm really looking forward to it. In the comments that you're going to hear, and the conversation that we're going to have, and then at the end of that, I'm going to come down into the audience physically, or I'll just throw the microphone down there and let you join the conversation. How many of you are clinicians or professionals or scientists or researchers in this field? Okay. Can we talk here a little bit today? I mean, can I do this? How many of you have breasts? Everybody, come on guys, everybody's hand goes up, all right? So we're all in this together, and in that spirit, I think I want to kick this thing off by reading from Florence's book, Breasts. Have you all got this book? Have you seen the book? If you don't, I commend it to you. Hi, Melissa. Breasts, a natural and unnatural history. I've always wanted to do audiobooks, you know, books on tape. I'd really like to read this one. Because it starts as follows. I'm sure a woman should be reading this instead of a man's voice, but fun bags, boobsters, chumbawambas, dinglebobbers, dairy pillows, jelly bonkers, num-nums. When I was growing up, Florence writes, my mother called them ninnies. That word, according to Webster's, means fools and lists nitwits, nutcases, and boobs as synonyms. For my own children, she writes, and whom my daughter is looking after as we speak, I amended the word to nummies, thinking it a bit kinder. We love breasts, she writes, yet we can't quite take them seriously. We name them affectionately, but with a hint of insult. Breasts embarrass us. They're unpredictable. They're goofy. They can turn both babies and grown men into lunkheads. You nailed it, Florence. And maybe not just grown men, but they are also, as we know, or can be, a health hazard. And they are part of a fantastically important conversation in the realm of public health. In the time in front of us this afternoon, you will hear from Florence, and you will hear from other experts. You will hear about the findings of a recently released report about breast cancer and prevention, with a heavy emphasis throughout our conversation here today, of course, on the word prevention. And as I mentioned, we'll open up the conversation to you in the audience after we hear from everyone. Let me introduce with a brief story of each of our guests. And what I love about our guests today is they are not only experts and brilliant and wonderful, but they are also all great stories, as I mentioned, in and of themselves. So Florence Williams is the author of this book, and you'll hear more about that. She is a prolific writer and journalist and thinker, with her work appearing in such diverse places as Slate, Mother Jones, the New York Times, and many other publications. She's an avid outdoors person who only recently moved from Boulder, Colorado, Washington, D.C. Let me work on that for a while. Boulder, Colorado. And she is certainly still adjusting to life in D.C. and the sound of the airplanes. Most importantly, she tells us she loves chocolate. Bittersweet or dark chocolate. That's better for you, they tell us. Jeanne Rizzo. Jeanne is amazing. She's president and CEO of the Breast Cancer Fund. She's a former nurse. How many people in the room know Jeanne personally? Wow, you have your own fan club. That is the coolest thing. She is also a nightclub owner who plays the drums. So when she hits the refrain, we should all follow her. She worked on a film about women climbing Mount McKinley, which sparked her interest in the environmental health movement. Linda Birnbaum. Linda? She is the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. She is a board-certified toxicologist, and she served as a federal scientist for nearly 32 years. Prior to her current role, she spent 19 years at the Environmental Protection Agency, directing the largest division that focuses on environmental health research. Now, like Jeanne, Linda has a musical side. She plays the guitar. Let's see, guitar and drums. We could put you two together. We're getting someplace here, and she's very engaged in the community, and she plans to climb a real mountain someday, but in her own way, she climbs mountains every day, so welcome. And finally, Conn Nugent. Conn is president of the H. John Heinz III Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment here in Washington. He spent his career devoted to nonprofits, including the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 when Conn was its first executive director. Since seen a little bit of movement on the whole issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. So Conn, you, I know, have contributed to that in many ways. He was born in Dublin, Ireland. He served on the Harvard Lampoon during his undergraduate days in Boston. Apparently he does not play the drums. No?
Badly.
Badly plays the drums. Guitar?
Worse.
Worse. Chocolate?
I'm terrible.
Okay. But it's my pleasure to start the program by introducing to you and turning the microphone over to Conn Nugent. Conn.
Hello, everyone. I represent, as Frank just told you, the Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment. I'm going to give you a thumbnail description, and I'm going to read it, but that's okay because I wrote it. The Heinz Center aims to restore nonpartisan environmentalism. We provide opportunities to discuss scientific and economic information from businesses, universities, government, and non-private organizations. The center is a living memorial to the late U.S. Senator John Heinz, Republican of Pennsylvania. Since 1995, we have worked to honor his legacy, a passion for the natural world, a commitment to science as the foundation for sound policy, and an enthusiasm for cooperation across the partisan aisle. It is that dedication to nonpartisanship and the salience of the important issues of our time that attracted the Heinz Center to this most excellent cooperative alliance we have with the Breast Cancer Fund and with GW. And thank you to Jeanne and to all of those who have labored in this field for so long and so fruitfully. But there is an enormous challenge that lies ahead. Allow me, if you will, to start with a personal anecdote. Not my person, but someone of a public personage. In 1810, Abigail Adams Smith, universally known as Nabby, detected what she described as a hardness in her right breast. Nabby was 43 years old, the only daughter of former President John Adams and his wife Abigail, mother of 4 children, and deeply cherished by all who knew her. Her father was a friend of the most esteemed physician and surgeon of the day, Dr. Benjamin Rush of Boston, and it was Dr. Rush who recommended immediate surgery. So in 1811, in her childhood bedroom in the Adams family home in Quincy, Massachusetts, adjacent to her parents' bedroom, Nabby underwent a radical mastectomy. The surgery itself consumed 30 minutes, the dressing of the wound 60 minutes. There was no anesthesia. 2 years later, the cancer returned, cruelly, painfully. Nabby insisted that she travel the 300 miles that separated her own family's home in New York State to return to the Adams house in Quincy. She was carried up the stairs and laid in her girlhood bed. Her pain was remorseless. She died a month later. "Oh, my dearest, darling daughter," wrote her father. Her mother could barely speak of it. So this scourge of breast cancer has been with us for a while. And I would suggest we should never take for granted the tremendous strides of medical science that have saved so many lives and have eased so much suffering over the last few decades. But as we meet here today, a woman in Brazil or Egypt or India undergoes the same ordeal as Nabby Adams did in 1813. We have to address this scourge. We speak on behalf of the human race, we have made enormous strides in detection, in treatment, and in recovery. We have, however, only made stumbling progress on figuring it out as to why it occurs. After the Second World War, the Nabby Adamses of the world stayed with us, and there was a growth in breast cancer cases more or less directly correlative with the growth in the population in general. After the Second World War, up goes the rate of infection, up go the number of fatalities, up go the number of cases. We have to embark on a glorious detective mission to find out what is behind that upsurge. What has occurred to all of us in the years since 1950 that might explain this exponential growth in an epidemic universally cursed. I can plead no expertise whatsoever in any of these matters, but I do believe that this challenge of preventing breast cancer is a challenge that has to engage women and men Democrats and Republicans, it's too important, too vital for us to squabble about what should be a united effort by all. And with that, I am happy to turn it over to a person, I was going to say who needs no introduction because Frank gave her a good one. Florence Williams is the author of Breast, A Natural and Unnatural History, and we have had the pleasure at the Heinz Center of hearing her speak to our trustees eloquently, humanely, and sometimes humorously. I think it's Florence is a unequaled package, if I may objectify you that way, Florence. And I'm happy to introduce you. Florence Williams.
I think package might be the right term. Actually, I think it's very appropriate to discuss breasts on Valentine's Day. We do all love them so much. It's a pleasure to be here in such really prestigious company. You know, I've been writing about environmental health for a long time, and so many of the heavyweights are really here in this room. Some of them will be on stage, some of you are in the audience, and it's been such a pleasurable discovery for me to learn from all of you. It's one of the great joys of journalism is that we really don't have to be experts in anything, but we get to meet all the experts. So I didn't set out to write a book about breast cancer. But when you write a book about breasts, sometimes that's what it has to become. It all started for me when I was breastfeeding my daughter. And I had never really thought much about my breasts before I became a mother. And suddenly I had this, sort of profound new relationship with them, a new way to respect them and to be awed by how they work, these wondrous organs that have long evolved over 200 million years. They even predate mammals, if you can believe that. So they're this miraculous organs, and I was really sort of enjoying feeling like a mammal. But then I saw some research that flame retardants were showing up in breast milk. And this I found very disconcerting as I was producing breast milk. And I do what journalists do, which is that I wanted to ask some questions and try to answer them through my work. So I set out to think about how to tell a story about flame retardants, which are these molecules that are sort of complex, very complex. And I realized that I had breast milk that I could actually test as a way to tell the story, sort of using the first person. And I got the New York Times Magazine interested in this topic. They assigned it. And I found a researcher who was studying flame retardants. He previously had studied Agent Orange, had moved on to flame retardants. So we FedExed a vial of my breast milk to a lab in Germany. It's one of the few places in the world that was able to find some of these very minute amounts of these industrial substances. And lo and behold, it came back. Actually, it took about 6 weeks to get the results back. And during that time, I did a lot of research about flame retardants and tried to figure out, what we knew about the health effects of flame retardants in humans. And it turns out we really didn't know very much. And frankly, I was a little smug about it because I thought, well, surely my levels won't be very high. One of the reasons we were concerned about flame retardants in the first place is that I believe it was some Danish researchers figured out that levels of flame retardants in human tissue was doubling every 5 years. And they were also finding flame retardants in polar bears and in birds and in fish. But I thought, well, surely my levels won't be that high because I was a very good girl as a pregnant woman, and then as a new mother, I was eating organic food, and I was exercising. I had taken my vitamins. I was living in a beautiful leafy town in the Rocky Mountains. So my results came back, and lo and behold, I actually turned out to have higher than average American levels for flame retardants, which are already 10 to 100 times higher than levels of women anywhere else in the world. And in fact, women in California have even higher levels than that, which maybe Jeanne will talk about. So this shocked me, and although the journalist in me was kind of psyched, because it gave me a sort of a good platform from which to tell this story. And it turns out that a lot of people did want to read this story. It was one of the most emailed, articles on the New York Times site that week. It got passed down from mother to mother. And it was kind of heartening to me as a science journalist to realize that there was a way to reach a wider audience with some of these stories by making them sort of relevant to our own health and to our children's health, because it's something that we all care about. And then I started learning more about breasts. And I learned that modern life is actually changing breasts in many other ways. I learned that breasts are actually getting bigger. And some people would think this is a good thing. But the reason for that, the primary reason for that is really our changing diets and the fact that we're getting bigger overall. Men are getting bigger, women are getting bigger, children are getting bigger. Obesity is a huge health problem. I also learned, as Lynn Goldman pointed out, that breasts are arriving earlier in young girls. And this is another thing to be concerned about, not only because we know now that it's a risk factor for breast cancer later on, but we also know that girls who develop earlier are at higher risk for sexual abuse and for substance abuse and for depression. So as parents and educators, I think this is something that is something we all care about. And as Conn pointed out, tumors are increasing in breast tissue. Rates have increased about 40% since World War II. And we know that men are getting breast cancer, and their rates are also increasing. And in fact, the group that's seeing the fastest rates of increase in breast cancer are women under 50. So we know that only really a small minority of those cancers are attributable to genes. And so there's something else going on. Or I should say that those women don't have family histories. But we do know that there is some sort of interaction between genes and the environment. So all of these are reasons to want to study the breast and to want to get past the visuals in the breast, which is usually what we tend to think about. So I was really motivated to write this book. And as I said, it's just been a fascinating journey. And I also continued to use the first person as a way to tell the story. With early puberty, I was particularly concerned about this because I have a daughter. And while I was writing the book, she'd grown up some. She was 6 or 7 while I was writing it. And so we decided to do some testing on her and on me. I found out that the NIEHS has spearheaded a fantastic study specifically looking at the causes of early puberty. And they're looking at a number of factors, including social factors, including lifestyle factors, but they're also looking at industrial and commercial chemicals. And so my daughter and I underwent some testing to figure out what our body levels were for products that we have in our shampoo, and products that we have in our bubble bath, and products that we have in our face creams. And then sort of interestingly, with some input from the Breast Cancer Fund and another group, the Silent Spring Institute, we did a dietary intervention study. So we tried to actually bring our levels down for some of these substances that are, by the way, known to alter hormonal systems in laboratory testing. And we were able to bring our levels down a lot, but it wasn't really a lot of fun because we had to stop using these shampoos and toothpaste. And I actually didn't even get in my car for a few days because our car is off-gas, phthalates in the plastic in the car. And I became a vegan for a few days. I lost a lot of weight. It just wasn't that fun. And it made me realize these really shouldn't be our decisions as mothers. We shouldn't have to go into the grocery store and sort of wonder what we're going to get from our can of soup. And is it going to alter our thyroid levels or mess up our mammary gland development? Really, we should look to government and to manufacturers to kind of do this for us. So I very much wear two hats in my book. One is as a woman and as a mother, and the other is as a journalist, sort of telling this environmental history of a body part. The main question that I wanted to ask is, why are breasts so vulnerable? What is going on? And the answer to that is really threefold. One is that they're among the fattiest organs in our bodies. And we know that certain industrial chemicals like flame retardants are attracted to fat. So they're hanging out there. Another is that our breasts are filled with hormone receptors. And of course, they're designed by nature to be this way. And it helps our breasts converse with the world around us and converse with our bodies. The hormones and the hormone receptors help tell our breasts when to grow. And they tell our breasts when to start building the dairy equipment when we're pregnant. And the third reason is that our breasts are unusually dynamic organs. They are constantly changing. And in fact, our breasts are our only organ that doesn't finish developing until well into adulthood. In fact, the breast doesn't finish growing up until the last trimester of pregnancy. So for many of us, that happens, even in our middle age when we have our first child, relatively speaking. So all of these contribute to making the breast much more vulnerable. Many anthropologists over the years have tried to answer the question of why humans have breasts. How did we get so lucky? Because our breasts, it turns out, are actually very different from those mammary glands of other primates. We have them kind of permanently from the age of puberty on. And one of the leading theories has been that breasts exist as a sexual signal, that they must be conveying information to men, telling potential mates something about our health or our fertility status. Since then, many others in the field have sort of challenged some of those theories and said, well, wait a minute, maybe breasts exist for reasons other than just men. Maybe there's something about them that helps women or helps the infant. But one thing I found out from this book is that breasts really still are a signal of a different kind. For me, breasts have really become a sentinel organ. They have become a metaphor for environmental health. And what's happening to our breasts is also happening to our bodies overall. And if we listen to them, we have much to learn about the way our world interacts with ourselves and how to live more healthfully in the world. And I think that's a good segue to introduce Jeanne Rizzo, who is the president of the Breast Cancer Fund and who has done much to drive research in this area. Jeanne, thank you very much.
I'm not going to play the drums, I promise. I'm not that good. Hi, everybody. There was a 42-year-old woman who had a 6-year-old daughter. She was just recently married to the love of her life. She was working for Senator Feinstein. She had a great career opportunity. She was just as the senator was about to be elected. And she found a lump in her breast. She had just had mammography 6 months earlier. Well, she went home. She went to the doctor, and she was told to go home and put her affairs in order. Andrea Martin decided if that was going to happen, she was going to change the world and change the legacy for her daughter. And she founded the Breast Cancer Fund with the idea that she had to understand this disease better. She had to understand why so many women were getting breast cancer, what was going on with such toxic treatments that were going on in that period of time. How could we get a screening that was non-invasive and non-toxic, and how could we actually save ourselves from this devastating disease? Andrea Martin began asking a very hard question in the mid-90s as breast cancer rates were escalating. She asked why. What were the causes of the disease beyond genetics, beyond when so few women have a family history of this disease? She asked that question, and that was almost heresy back then. She actually also asked the question, could we create a pathway to prevention? We were not talking about the prevention of breast cancer at that period of time. So I start every day that I get up for work, and every time I have the opportunity to be with people, to remind myself of why I'm doing this work, and to remind all of us to think about the women and the men that we have lost that aren't in the room. So we're gathered, and there are empty seats here. And there are empty seats because there are people that would have come to this had they not become diagnosed with breast cancer or passed on from breast cancer. So take a moment. There are women in this room living with the diagnosis of breast cancer, have a close friend or family member. So I'm going to take a moment to bring Andrea into the room, and I invite you to bring someone into the room that's dear to you, so that we spend this time together remembering why we're here. And if anyone wants to call out a name, you're welcome to. The Breast Cancer Fund is dedicated to preventing breast cancer by working to understand, to identify, to mitigate the environmental causes of the disease, because in our view, that's the voice that needs to be added to the discussion about breast cancer. That's what we spend our time on. We spend our time looking at the science, translating that into public health advocacy, into policy efforts, into corporate accountability efforts, the kinds of things that Florence was talking about where are the environmental toxins present in toxicants present in our everyday lives, how can we actually change the commerce of this. We also talk about how to bring this message forth in a collaborative way, as we're doing today with Lynn Goldman, with Conn, Nugent, and of course with Dr. Birnbaum and Florence. So we're here today to talk about one of the roles that the Breast Cancer Fund has played, which is to be at every table. My attitude is this: if you're not at the table, you're on somebody's menu. So it's a really good idea to sit at the tables wherever the discussions about breast cancer and the environment are happening, so that we can bring voices to it. I had the privilege of serving on a committee with a very long name called the Interagency Breast Cancer and Environmental Research Coordinating Committee. We called it IBERSERC because that was the best we could do with the acronym. This committee was mandated by an act of Congress. In 2008, the Breast Cancer and Environmental Research Act was passed and directed the Secretary of HHS to create a committee that was composed of scientists, academic researchers, people representing the different agencies of government, nonprofit advocates representing breast cancer survivors and the breast cancer issue, and to come together and to come back with recommendations to the Secretary as to what could be done about breast cancer in the environment and breast cancer in general, to assess the state of the science, what goes on with the research process, and how are we actually going to make an impact. That committee met for over 2.5 years and was stewarded very grandly by people who are in this room right now under the direction of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. I want to recognize Dr. Gwen Coleman, who was amazing in holding us all together for this 2.5 years. Jenny Collins, who is here at NIEHS, is Debbie Wynn here from National Cancer Institute. They tasked us to be bold, to be innovative, to be vigilant, to have rigor, to reach deeply into discussions, and to debate and explore and investigate this issue. And that's what we did. And I have the privilege, as a co-chair of that committee, just 2 days ago, we released this report to the public. It is now on Secretary Sebelius's desk, and this is the first public discussion of that report. What the conclusion of that report could have been anything from the first day that we sat down. We did not have a title. We did not have an end of what this report would look like. We said we had to look at it and we had to come up with our strongest recommendations as to how to deal with breast cancer. And the name of the report is Breast Cancer in the Environment, Prioritizing Prevention. And I think that tells you where we arrived at the end of our deliberations, which, as I said, went on for 2.5 years. So you've heard about the breast cancer burden. We can talk about 250,000 women being diagnosed with invasive breast cancer. That raw number is up in 2013. Then there are women diagnosed with ductal carcinoma. So there are, think of every woman and man who has heard you have breast cancer. And increasingly we know that men are as well. There were 2,200 men in 2012, more in 2013. 40,000 women and men will die of breast cancer every year, and 3 million women and men are amongst us in this country, having been diagnosed with breast cancer and having their lives forever altered by treatment, by worry, by surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. So, this is not a disease. This has become almost a accepted normalization of breast cancer. You'll get breast cancer, but we can treat you and you will live longer. And that's not good enough in our view and in the view of the committee. So we go on, if I can press the button. Why did we address environmental factors? We addressed them because genetic and environmental factors individually contribute and interact with each other to increase breast cancer risk. But the rates vary depending on what your environmental circumstances are, and a large number, overwhelming majority of breast cancer cases occur when there is no family history. We also know that environmental factors can be readily identified and modified more easily than genetic factors can. So the conclusion of the committee is that they present a tremendous opportunity for the prevention of breast cancer. So why don't we know more? As we were talking earlier, why haven't we done this sooner, as Conn raised? Why haven't we known more about it? Well, one, we haven't been looking at environmental exposure in the correct life stage. We've come to understand that breast cancer doesn't start in a woman my age. It starts way earlier. It may start in utero, early childhood, during windows of susceptibility. And the report goes into great depths talking about that. Lynn referred to it. I know Linda will go more into that. But we hadn't really explored the windows of susceptibility, and we hadn't examined the correct environmental agents that could be contributing to the disease. So we weren't asking the right questions, and we weren't asking the right questions about the complex mixtures that we're exposed to all, and what different subtypes of breast cancer arise. We didn't know how to do that. We have new learning now. We have a new obligation. The more we know, the more we're obligated to explore. So the key themes, as I mentioned, that are in this. Look at this report. Oh, my proud day. Okay, 270 pages of glorious holiday weekend reading. I really commend you to it. Seriously, it's so much fun. And it really is, actually. And then what we also have is a 4-page summary for those of you that would like to get started with the 4-page summary. It's out in the lobby and available to you. We also talk about the fact that we have to look at animal research to give us clues and understand what's going on with humans based on what is going on with animals. And there's a tremendous strides being made in that, and have to take advantage of it. We identified areas where additional research are needed, and we've got them laid out within the report. The causes of breast cancer overall by subtype. There is no one breast cancer. There are multiple breast cancers. We need to understand that better. We need to understand causes of breast cancer by race and ethnicity. The highest increased rate of breast cancer is amongst premenopausal African-American women. Latina women are suffering in a different way. We have to understand that. We have to test for environmental exposures, monitor those exposures, and there are methodological issues that I'm not going to go into, that people like Linda can, about how we do this. We also have to understand better, how do we assess risk? How do we actually do that so that we can inform policy? So we did a deep analysis of the federal funding and non-governmental funding of breast cancer and the environment research and prevention. And let me start by saying, because it hasn't risen to the level of priority that it needs to, it's not like there's a checkbox when someone's actually doing it. It took a tremendous amount of sleuthing to arrive at what are the maximum numbers for the expenditures, both in terms of projects that are funded and dollars that are spent. And for many of you who don't know, the Department of Defense is a pretty big funder of breast cancer research. That's part of our war on cancer, which I don't think we're winning, and also the National Institute of Health, which is several agencies in NIH. And of course, the National Institute of Environmental Health Science spends all of its research on breast cancer on the environment, for which we're very grateful. So the other thing that we took into account was not just research itself and the process of doing research, but how do we translate, disseminate, and communicate that? And what are the policy implications of the research findings when we arrive at them? So bridging the gap between knowledge and action was very important, and it requires that we close that gap with preventative public health measures. That when science, it can take 15, 20 years from a scientific achievement to result in clinical practice or the communication to the public. And there has been a long history of holding back on making the information public because the public won't know what to do with it. Well, part of that's over. You can find anything you want on the internet. So there's no way to shield people from it anyway, and we have a right to know. And that came up very strongly in our report. Because policy matters, and I don't just mean legislative policy at all. I'm talking about the policies within agencies and across agencies, about how research is conducted and reported, how we translate that into prevention strategies. Policies can guide the development of safety assessments of alternative chemicals. We can get a bad actor chemical out of something that's replaced with something that's just as bad, and we're scurrying to catch up to see what did they come up with. Right? If they're going to take bisphenol A out of baby bottles, what are they putting in the baby bottles? So then, the advocates are running around trying to retest and figure out what they're doing. So we have to have a way that we look at those chemicals. There's also policies can ensure our right to know. There are many policies that bar us from knowing the ingredients in products that we use every day. It's called confidential business information. You can look at something and see the word fragrance, and you have no idea what's in that fragrance. So you have a right to know what you're being exposed to. Also, environmental justice. We all know that there are those that are disproportionately affected because of where they live and what they're exposed to, and their lack of political heft and weight in the discussion. Also, we can improve the built environment. As we build communities, as we expand communities, we need to be thinking about how do we make them healthy environments. We can also implement the research into public health programs, and I think that's what Lynn is doing so heroically here, and anyone who's a student here should just be so proud to be part of this program. And of course, we can facilitate primary prevention. So the specific policy implications of the report, because I'm hoping that Linda will have an opportunity to comment on how NEHS might implement those pieces that are the science pieces, so I'm going to talk about policy implications of this Federal Advisory Committee's report, which is to prioritize human studies that evaluate pubertal timing. You've heard about that earlier. These are very important. And environmental exposures across the life course, from in utero all the way through, so we can understand better what those exposures do at different times, windows of susceptibility. We want to require the collection, we require the collection and evaluation of mammary gland samples for testing. If you don't test the target organ for the disease, how will you understand the impact of that exposure on that? So mammary gland testing is very important. We want to expand the biomonitoring programs. And I don't know if you know, we have a federal biomonitoring program. It's similar to what Florence said she did, tested her breast milk, blood, urine, cord blood, to understand the chemicals that are getting into our bodies. We not only have to do more of that and have that be more a part of how we assess health, but we also have to let the public know what the results of those are. And we have to make that information not only available, part of the health assessment of product safety. Prioritize the testing of chemicals that are produced in high volumes, for which there already is biologically plausible evidence that they have a role. So if you've got a chemical that in one of these fancy assays that they have at the National Toxicology Program lights a board up, well, we should prioritize that, especially if it's a high production volume that most of us are exposed to. And again, address the gaps in risk assessment and create a mechanism within the federal government to facilitate strategic planning across the agency so that we can get this done. And of course, continue to use and expand the relationship with advocates and stakeholders in this process. So the path forward, simply rolled up, all those things that are in 270 pages are rolled into 7 key recommendations that are essentially what we've been talking about today. And you can drill down and you can roll them up into what the key recommendations of this report are, which as I said, are now on the Secretary's desk. We can go into more depth with you during the Q&A. And also, we would encourage you all to, if you find these recommendations to be powerful and important to you, let the Secretary know that they are important to you. And that's it. Thank you. And now, I have the privilege of introducing one of my absolute all-time heroes, Dr. Linda Birnbaum. Thank you, Linda. Good.
So everyone, it's really great to be here, and it's so exciting to see so many of you who are interested in this topic. I'm really eager to tell you about some of the work that the NIEHS and the National Toxicology Program are doing in this area. We are one of the 27 institutes and centers of the NIH. We are the only one who is not located in Bethesda. We are actually located in North Carolina. Go Carolina. But anyway, I shouldn't say that. There are probably Dukies and state fans in the audience anyway. But anyhow, Jeannie, did you take the clicker? Jeannie. Oh, no, it's here. She hit it. Okay. So what I want to really do a little bit today is give you some flavor of the kinds of work that's going on and some of the issues that we're dealing with. So we actually know that environmental factors are responsible for at least 2/3 of the cancer cases in the United States. Now, the environment can be defined very broadly, and it involves things as everything outside the body, and that includes what you eat, what you drink, what you smoke. Different kinds of things do different kinds of things to the body. Different kinds of environmental chemicals, different kinds of infectious agents, not only viruses and bacteria, your level of stress. All these things are part of our environment. And they interact in all cases with who we are, with our genetic information. So we've got to stop talking about is it genes or is it environment, because it's always going to be both. And I have to say, although we know that if you have a sister who has had breast cancer, you're at increased risk, or if you had a mother who had breast cancer, you're at increased risk, we have to begin to ask, is that risk totally genetic? Or in fact, is it because you had a similar environment? You know, if you're two sisters, you grew up in the same environment, as well as having the same or related genes. So what I'd like to do is just briefly go over some of these, because Jeannie's already talked about the fact that over 227,000 women and 2,400 men will be diagnosed with breast cancer, and 40,000 of them are anticipated to die this year. That the cost to breast cancer are going to outpace the other forms of cancer. Now, part of that is the fact that we have been relatively successful at developing some intervention and treatment strategies for breast cancer, and in certain cases, breast cancer has become a chronic disease, so that women can live having this disease while previously they would have died. But I think the important thing is if you look at this graph, and this isn't showing up too well, but you can see the different color lines, and these are looking at some of our different ethnic groups. And while the line at the top are the numbers, for example, of the cost of breast cancer in lives, what you can see is that's African Americans, the mortality per 100,000 women. So although while the incidence of breast cancer in African American women is lower than in Caucasian women, African American women tend to have more virulent forms of breast cancer. And we also know that, for example, the cost of breast cancer continues to increase in the actual cost of treatment dollars. So you can see red is what it was 2 or 3 years ago. By 2020, it continued to increase. Now, as Jeannie mentioned, most cases of breast cancer occur in women with no family history. So that because your mom, your grandmom, your aunt, your sister didn't have it doesn't mean that you won't. And we also know that breast cancer rates vary with changing environmental circumstances. So we've known for probably 30 years that when women emigrated to this country, when they came from Japan, we knew that within 2 generations, their risk of breast cancer had gone up dramatically. Their genes don't change that quickly. Our genes take generations, multi-generations to change, but the environment changed dramatically. And the point that I want to make here is you can't change your genes, but you can change your environment. So what are some of the breast cancer risk factors for women? Now, having these risk factors doesn't mean that you will get breast cancer. It just means you are more likely. It's a statistical probability kind of thing. So we know that, for example, and some of these risk factors you can't do anything about. As I said, you can't change your genes, and you can't change your family history. You can't change the fact that every year you are lucky enough to have a birthday, and therefore that you're getting older. But there are, and you can't change the age, or at this point, we don't know how you could change the age that you enter puberty or the age that you enter menopause. But there are certain things that you can choose. For example, you can control your extent of radiation exposure. You may be able to control how much alcohol you consume. We know that obesity is a great risk. That's the wrong way. It's not a great risk factor. It's a terrible risk factor, but it has a great impact on your risk for breast cancer. And part of that is, as I think Lynn mentioned, it's a metabolic change, but part of it is we know that the greatest risk factor actually for breast cancer is your lifetime exposure to estrogen. And we do know that adipose cells produce estrogen as well. So that's something to think about. We know that breastfeeding reduces your risk, for example, of breast cancer. We know that women with high breast density, again, something that we don't think you can control, increases the risk. We know that something like DES, and I'm actually going to show you a little bit of data later on. Since I'm a scientist, I can't help that. But we know that women who were exposed to DES have a higher risk of breast cancer, and their daughters have a higher risk of breast cancer. And now there's some evidence that their granddaughters may have a higher risk of breast cancer as well. And there are many other environmental exposures and the diet that can help predict breast cancer. So some of the research challenges that we're facing related to breast cancer are completely linked and are integral to our NIEHS strategic plan, which we just released just about 6 months ago, where we're recognizing the timing of exposure and the windows of susceptibility, and you've already heard those concepts mentioned. We're really interested in understanding what is your personal exposure. Not only, how much is in the food or how much is in the water or what's going on in the air, but how much are you as an individual exposed to? And how do we want to measure that? Well, we've got to develop kind of relatively non-invasive ways by measuring biomarkers. We need to look at individual biological responses and try to account for what is your genetic susceptibility. And we want to try to identify those chemicals that can cause cancer that act through altering how our genes are turned on, which we now understand is due to something called epigenetics, which are putting little marks on our DNA that tell it when to turn on and when to turn off, as well as things that actually can damage DNA. So things like endocrine disruptors and traditional carcinogens that might actually cause a mutation in your DNA. So there are many windows of susceptibility. Again, this was alluded to for breast cancer during a woman's life. It's not just what happens in utero. It's not just what happens, for example, in early childhood. It's not just what happens in puberty, although we all know that puberty is a time of massive changes that occur in many parts of our body, certainly and in the breast. We know that pregnancy is a time where the breast undergoes very rapid and extensive development. Of course, after pregnancy, during lactation, there are other changes that occur. And then after menopause, the breast undergoes more changes. All of these times when your body is rapidly developing and differentiating and cells are dividing, that's the time that damage can most likely occur. So in our program, and I'm going to talk in a minute about what's called BSERP, and the government, we love acronyms, so you heard about IBSERC. BSERP is the Breast Cancer and the Environment Research Program. It is a program that we share with the National Cancer Institute, and it is now in about its 9th year of existence. But what we're doing here is we're actually trying to look at the windows of susceptibility. So starting, we have studies that are looking at what's happening during pregnancy, before puberty, during adolescence, during pregnancy and afterwards, and during menopause. And we have studies that are involving not only human cohorts, we're also trying to understand what are the basis for the changes that we see by doing studies in cell cultures and doing studies in animals as well. And like, for example, we've heard several, whoops, sorry, I did go forward before I wanted to. We've heard about the issue of the changing in the time of puberty. So it was one of our grantees, Frank Biro from the University of Cincinnati, who's a pediatrician. And following, we now have cohorts that we recruited of young girls when they were about 6 years old, and we are following them. We are doing this in a culturally appropriate way because you can't do these studies in a community unless the community is engaged from the very beginning, telling you what are their concerns and telling you and asking you what they are interested in and us working with them. And we're going into these communities and we're doing measurements of timing of puberty in these young girls. And what Frank Biro reported was that the age of puberty has dropped dramatically. And I'm not talking about going back to 1700 or 1800. I'm talking about going back to the mid-90s. So that we now know that by the age of 8, about 50% of African-American girls have already entered puberty. That about, I think it's about 25% of Hispanic girls have entered puberty, and about 18% of Caucasian girls have started to enter puberty. These are dramatic changes that have occurred in the population. If you enter puberty at a younger age, you're starting to be exposed to estrogen, higher levels of estrogen at a younger age. That may increase your risk as you go forward for breast cancer. So Jeanne's already introduced you to the Breast Cancer and the Environmental Research Act that was signed into law by President Bush in October of 2008. And this actually amended the Public Health Service Act and established this committee. Now, this was a kind of unusual federal committee because I can tell you usually that the federal advisory committees cannot have federal members on them. But this committee was explicitly set up to have federal members representing those agencies that are conducting research on breast cancer. It was defined to have scientists and physicians who are conducting breast cancer research, who are not in the federal government, and then it required that we have the same number of people who are involved in the advocacy community and interested in what is it and what can they do to deal with the scourge of breast cancer. And while this was assigned to Secretary Sebelius, she ended up, what shall I say, downloading the responsibility first to my boss, Francis Collins, and then I had the pleasure of, and you've already been introduced to some of the wonderful people, Debbie Wynn from NCI, Gwen Coleman from my institute, and Jenny Collins as well, who really shepherded this effort through. And so I couldn't talk about this committee without showing you the pictures. Debbie and Gwen are actually in this. Gwen and Debbie, I'm sorry, I think this is not working very well. And right in the middle, you can see the smiling Jeanne. This was a very, very exciting group that worked incredibly hard to reach consensus on the issues of prioritizing prevention. So you've already seen Jeanne lifted the, anybody want to exercise? Anyhow, the copy, and I should have mentioned exercise is a good thing to do as far as it reduces your risk for breast cancer. But I urge you, if you haven't already picked up the 4-page kind of summary information, it's an easy read, and it does give you the link. This document is living on the NIEHS website, I should say. So the important things that came out of this is prevention is the key. Our genetic and environmental factors both contribute and interact to increase the risk of breast cancer. And we know that breast cancer rates vary with the environmental circumstances. As I've said, that the large majority occur in women with no history, family history, and it's easier for us to identify and modify the environmental factors. So the IBICIRC report aligns with our strategic plan, and That's what I call the cloud diagram, because you can't do, for example, basic research without relating it to exposure, without relating it to translational research, without being involved, for example, in training and education, without dealing with the issues that we've already heard of environmental justice and health disparities, and that we have to engage the community from the very, very beginning. And frankly, you cannot conduct today's 21st century research without working in a collaborative manner and without developing extensive data management and knowledge management tools to work with huge amounts of information. So I've already mentioned the Breast Cancer and the Environment Research Program, which is really focusing on windows of susceptibility and different kind of risk factors, and trying to work to engage the community in the conduct of research as well as the translation of research. We are investing over $31 million. That was last year's budget. Over the last 5 years, we have routinely spent in the $30 to $35 million per year looking at breast cancer and the environment questions. We fund over 30 breast cancer research grants. We have 12 breast cancer research centers where we are focusing on the pubertal issues. We are working with the nascent or the developing National Children's Study to put in the correct environmental exposures and have them begin to ask the right questions as they recruit infants into this birth cohort. We have also many intramural programs that are looking at breast cancer and programs in the National Toxicology Program. So I just briefly wanted to mention a little bit about our sister study and the Two Sisters study. The sister study is a very, I think, important and groundbreaking study. We started recruiting women in 2004, completed recruiting 51,000 women in 2009, so we have a very large cohort. We're going to be following them all for at least 10 years. What is unique about these women? It's called the sister study. That's because they have a sister who had breast cancer. So we know that these women have about a twofold higher risk of getting breast cancer. So we're more likely to be able to identify not only genetic factors, but we're also following lots of environmental measures in these women as we go forward over 10 years. There's real power in doing studies when you follow what happens over the course of time. And so it's going to enhance our ability to study the interaction between genes in the environment to help us better identify cancer risk factors, and especially those that we can prevent. Now, the Two Sisters study is nested within the sister study, and in this case, we have gone we have all this, biomedical and historical information on the 51,000 women that we recruited, and we've gone through that. And for those who had a sister who developed breast cancer before the age of 50, we've said, would you like to invite your sister who survived her breast cancer, or at least so far, to join a study here? And we have now recruited 1,500 women into this cohort. And this group, we not only have the women, but we have most of their parents as well. So this gives us tremendous opportunities for genetic power, as well as understanding life stages, things that went on in their life, and environmental exposures. We think this is going to be very important. And I should tell you that while these studies are new, we're already getting some data from them. Now, I can't tell you, because we haven't gotten to 10 years yet, so we don't have certainly all the findings, but we've already found, and this is probably not a surprise, that stress and obesity are associated with shorter telomeres. Now, telomeres are at the ends of your chromosomes. You all got 23 pairs of chromosomes, and at the ends, you've got telomeres. And we've known for quite a number of years that as you get older, those telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter. And what we're finding is that stress, it says perceived here, but it's also measured stress by measuring hormonal levels, and obesity lead to shorter telomeres. The good news, because I always want to give you some good news, is take your vitamins, because in fact, women who reported taking multivitamins and also vitamin D were associated with longer telomeres. So that's the good news. In the Two Sisters study, we've also found some good news so far, which showing that women who took fertility drugs in order to become pregnant, that those appear to reduce their risk of early onset breast cancer. So that's encouraging, and that's good news. Now, I also I mentioned to you before that we do studies in cell culture in animals to help us understand, especially from environmental chemicals, what's going on in the breast. You know, you're not going to intentionally expose people to chemicals that we know are bad. Of course, as Jeanne mentioned, we're all exposed all the time to a soup of chemicals that we know very little about. But for example, PFOA, which is on top, these are studies actually from mice and rats. And PFOA, that's the chemical that is in your Teflon nonstick fry pans, or that can come out of them. And it's also things in Gore-Tex. You know, when you go hiking and you think you're doing really good stuff, and you got your Gore-Tex hiking boots and your jacket, that's the kind of chemical there. And what you shows here, if you look at the one on your left, that's a control mouse just before, just at the end of weaning. And it's got, you know, a nice, healthy-looking ductal structure in the breast. These are pathology slides, histology. And if you look at the mouse that was exposed to an extremely low dose of PFOA, I mean extremely low, what you find, and it was exposed just during pregnancy, not during lactation, what you find is the breast is you have much reduced ductal structure. And in this bottom one is a study looking at DES, which I've already mentioned we know is associated with breast cancer in women. I will tell you, we never would have known it caused breast cancer in women because the incidence is so high. You know that 1 in 8 women is going to get breast cancer. But so we never would have known it if we didn't know that DES was associated with vaginal adenocarcinoma in young women. That was such a rare cancer that that was like a red flag flying, and then people began to look. So we're trying to understand more of exactly how this does this and how it affects the breast. So we're doing studies in rats, and here we show the one on your right. This is the exposed just at 2 days of gestation in the rat as compared to the control, and what you see is there's excess too many cells there, which can be an indicator. And we also have an indicator of susceptibility to carcinogenesis. And we also have the receptors that are very important in your breast, the estrogen receptor and the progesterone receptor. Their expression is totally altered. And we're beginning to understand how important these receptors are, not only controlling of the normal breast, but I think you all know that if a woman has breast cancer, one of the first things that they do is look at her estrogen receptor and progesterone receptor status. Because if she has an active estrogen receptor, she's a good candidate for tamoxifen treatment. But if she's estrogen receptor negative in her breast tissue, then tamoxifen isn't going to help her at all. So another thing, I wanted to just give this example with DDT. I think you all know, Florence has already mentioned that she was surprised to find that she'd had DDT, or really its derivative DDE, in her body. DDT was banned in the 1970s from this country. I will say it is basically banned worldwide, but it is still used in cases where they have nothing else to control malaria. It is still used in Mexico, for example. It is still used in parts of Africa. So some of our Hispanic women who have come from Mexico have very high levels, but everyone in this room has DDE in their body. The interesting thing, these are some studies done looking at samples from women from a study that was conducted in California, where they took blood samples from women who were pregnant in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And when they went back and they looked recently at which of these women had breast cancer, what they found was that the women who were under the age of 4 when DDT spraying started had the highest risk of breast cancer. And that if they were, for example, 4 to 7, their risk went down a little bit, 8 to 13, but guess what? If they were 14, that was about the time of puberty, okay, at that point in time, their risk was really quite low. So there's a susceptibility issue. The very young, in fact, if they were less than 4, in fact, maybe they were in utero at that time. We have to go back and look at that. But really suggests that there's a window of susceptibility to DDT especially during development. Now, I've already mentioned that NIEHS works very, very closely with our community partners. Here's just a list of some of the community partners that we work with in our breast cancer programs, a wide group of different groups ranging from adults to young girls, different kinds of ethnicities, different kinds of backgrounds. And one of the things that's really important here is making sure that we can get our message out to different people, so that we have developed extensive fact sheets that are readable related to the environmental factors in breast cancer risk. We have worked with our community partners to develop multi-language newsletters and reports and web pages. The breast biologues from Zero Breast Cancer Group at your bottom left is a marvelous little video about breast cancer and of mice and women modeling breast cancer in the environment that was put together by one of our community engagement cores in the Bay Area around San Francisco. So I really think that as we begin to prioritize prevention, we want to continue to focus our studies on early environmental exposures and human puberty. We need to understand what are those critical windows for breast cancer risk. We need to continue to try to understand how our animal models inform us about what's going on in human studies. And I often remind people that human beings are a kind of animal. We need to continue work to develop biomarkers that will allow us to indicate that the exposure may be going on so that we can do something about it. And we really all need to work together to prevent breast cancer. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Linda. And let me invite the panelists to come on up and take their seats for the conversation. While you're doing that, I want to read another passage, and a very different kind of passage from Florence's book. And it spins directly, Linda, out of what you were just talking about. Florence, you're right that in the United States, 700 new chemicals come into the market each year, joining 82,000 already in use. Of these 82,000 chemicals, only a few hundred have ever been tested for health effects, right? Despite the 35-year existence of government regulatory agencies and their guiding laws in the United States, including the Toxic Substances Control Act, only 5 chemicals have ever been banned. Is that right?
Under the Toxic Substances Control Act.
So let me come on over here and sit down. And here's the way this will work. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions here to get us rolling, and then I'm plunging down to join you all and to run around with a microphone because I need my exercise. Actually, there's a microphone there, so you'll be able to stand up. So I want to ask all of you the most basic question, it seems to me, as I listen to this, and it's compelling. If the focus is going to be on breast cancer prevention, and maybe it's an overly simplistic question, but sometimes those are the best kind. Who prevents and how? Is this regulation? Is this John and Jane Q. Citizen? Is this Whole Foods? I mean, it's a big word. I mean, it's a little word with a big splash. Anybody want to start?
Well, you want to go, Lynn?
I would start by saying I think it's everyone. I think that, you know, having a lot of intimate knowledge of how the regulatory system works, I used to do that in a former life at EPA. The most important thing that actually the government ought to be doing on the regulatory side is actually making sure that chemicals have been evaluated so we can see if they might cause cancer. And those animal tests and other tests that are done may not always pinpoint where those cancers might occur in our bodies. But certainly if we know that there's a chemical causing cancer in animals, there's a good bet that it's causing cancer in humans, and whether it's breast cancer or any other kind of cancer, we should be avoiding that. And we're not able to do that when we don't have that most fundamental information. But that being said, there's so much use of chemicals and pesticides in our society that I have trouble understanding why we do it. And so For example, we are sold products to completely sterilize all kinds of things in our household that don't actually have to be perfectly sterile. And so I think we can be more thoughtful about how we use products, and where we don't know what the risks are, to be more cautious about having those around us.
You tried that. You did that.
I did. Well, and I'll say one of my pet peeves, you mentioned things that sterilize our house, but we're also frequently told in TV commercials to buy room deodorizers, toilet bowl deodorizers, to make our houses feel cleaner and fresher. But the irony is we are making our bodies more polluted when we use these scent stabilizers, many of which are hormone disruptors. So I think there's this consumer culture that tells us to buy this stuff, and we have to be smarter about it. But I also think it's unfair to place the full onus on the individual, because we are told it's our fault if we get breast cancer. We're too fat, we drank too much, we smoked too much. There is not enough accountability, I think, being placed on industrial causes, commercial causes, and that's why this report is so great. I mean, it really does make an effort to say, look, there are many people responsible for breast cancers. It's not just you as an individual, and we really need to get to the bottom of it.
Jeanne?
There was a report from the President's Cancer Panel that came out, and it's cited in our report, about the war on cancer every couple of years, and it talked about cancer in the environment. And it starts off saying that there is undue industry influence on the regulatory policies in this country that would protect us better. So I think we've got to have a dialogue with industry, a very strong dialogue, I would suggest. There was just recently a baby cologne that came out. Okay, to your point, a baby cologne. I mean, do babies need cologne? So I know, but it's just unfathomable to me. But I think that we as individuals can't shop our way out of it, but we can certainly put pressure.
Who's the we who's supposed to have this conversation with industry? Government, citizens,
all
NGOs?
All of us. NGOs can be representative. Who convenes the representative? You've got people that have been elected, that are elected from where you live, that have votes.
We're in real trouble now.
Okay. But they will or won't get elected based on what's important to you. So the moms groups, I will just give an example of an effective group in terms of business decisions and in terms of policy, have been moms. When they don't want baby bottles with this chemical in it, then it moves the market, but it also sends a really strong message. We have to be very vocal and engaged in this. So I think that if we just get resigned and pessimistic about it, then we're not going to accomplish it.
Linda, you've been involved in this virtually all your professional life. What did you learn? What was most striking to you from this report?
I think I think kind of what Jeanne was getting at, that everybody needs to get involved. Now, I agree with Florence completely. We can't put the onus on everybody to do something. The biggest bang for our healthcare dollar comes not from individual treatment, but it comes from the big public health measures where everyone can be impacted. That's, we often talk in public health about the best thing that ever happened was, 170 years ago when John Snow took the handle off the pump during a cholera epidemic, and it completely basically ended the epidemic. So that I think we need to be looking at what can be done that will impact everyone, that will have an effect, because I don't think we can expect everyone to be their own police person and police it. I don't think every person, I know that, when I go to the supermarket and I'm busy looking at the labels, after a while you just forget it, you just grab it because you're just going on. So I do think that. The other thing, though, I think is real important, and Jeanne alluded to this, we've got to be really careful that, for example, it was the moms and the advocates who very rightly, listening to some of the research that was conducted that raised concerns about BPA, they're the ones who put the pressure that led to the removal of BPA from baby bottles. But what's been now put into baby bottles, we really don't know if it's any safer. And that's what Lynn said. We have to begin to be looking and understanding whether chemicals are safe before we use them. And so one thing that my institute is doing in collaboration with other parts of NIH and with FDA and with EPA is developing better 21st century testing methods so that we can test not 10 chemicals a year in long-term animal studies that take 2 or 3 years or even longer, but that we can get indications of what are the bad actors very quickly and then prioritize our efforts to study those.
Look at me. Can I, speaking of prevention, right? And I did that actually out of outrage because I'm thinking, wait a minute here. Baby bottles, we know something's bad in baby bottles, and then we make more baby bottles and we don't know what's, how is it possible that we are coming up with new chemicals and putting them into products like baby bottles to replace something that we know is bad, but we don't even know what we're replacing them with?
Well, they know what they're replacing it with.
But we don't know what the health impact is.
Because they're not
Do we?
obligated. No, because there's no pre-market testing required. They're not obligated. They don't invest in green chemistry where they really look at how could they come up with something that would not have an impact on health of the environment. They're not obliged to. Industry, the American Chemistry Council,
and they know,
and all of the trade association. They don't have to know, so they don't bother to know.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But even that example, okay, so the bisphenol A, the BPA that was in the baby bottles, also has been in the linings of cans, like for infant formulas.
Right.
Now that is tightly regulated by the Food and Drug Administration because infant formula needs to be absolutely safe and pure. It can't be contaminated with microbes, has to be completely safe. And so in that case, they have not replaced the bisphenol A. Why? Because FDA would require that the alternative material, that you would have some data about the alternative material, that you would know if there are chemicals migrating from that material into the infant formula, that would also be protective of the formula in terms of microbes and all the other ways that you want it to be safe. And the fact that they haven't been able to cross that hurdle, but then some of these things have gone into baby bottles, I think that is telling you something about what's going on. Now, they're completely alternative materials that, I mean, I think we do know that some of the things that baby bottles are made of are completely safe. I mean, glass baby bottles are completely safe. And so it's not that there are no baby bottles that are safe, but it's just that there are chemicals very similar to bisphenol A. This is, and I think actually, a recent publication in your institute's journal, Linda, that showed that there are chemicals that are just like brother and sister to bisphenol A, by all intents and purposes the same thing, that now start to show some of the same estrogenic effects. And that's kind of shocking to think, okay, they just replaced that. People thought it was safe because it can say bisphenol A free. It doesn't mean anything if they just put a lookalike chemical in.
Right.
A couple more questions and then we'll come to the audience. She's a journalist here. You got this new report. Tell her what her next assignment should be. What should she be writing about?
She'd be writing about the report. And the paradigm shift.
No, but
well, that this is a paradigm shift. I mean, I think that that covering this report and the dialogue about this report and what it's calling on the federal government to do, to really look at, is a major shift in thinking.
It says new evidence, new agenda. All right?
That's what we're here for.
I know. What are the 3 most important things, do you think, in this new agenda that the federal government should be doing?
Do you want to take it?
Well, I think I would. Well, this is putting me a little bit uncomfortable.
Okay, well,
I can tell you what the important research areas are. Okay. I can't tell you what the federal government should do. I can tell you what we're interested in funding.
You can do that.
Which we're interested in funding trying to understand the environmental causes of breast cancer and how environmental causes can increase the growth of breast cancer. We're trying to understand who is most susceptible at what time in their lives they're most susceptible, and we would like people to work together so that we can all improve our lives.
We need to prioritize prevention equally to treatment, cure, and access to care. It has to be on equal footing. Whatever that takes to do that, we need to consider that across the continuum, that it is as important. I think that message needs to come out loud and clear.
I mean, functionally, so Linda's institute, the Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, is the only institute in the NIH that's just focused on environmental exposures, but they're responsible for looking at those in relationship to every single disease and other entity, whether it's you're not growing as well, how you age, not just development of disease, health generally. And so it's really, how do you crack that nut of the National Cancer Institute, which has far more research funding, and seeing more of that funding going to research that has to do with prevention. And it's not just the people who work in the National Cancer Institute, but it's all the scientists who serve on peer review boards that actually make the decisions about which studies are going to be funded, and reaching them to say this is important, and that, well, you know, maybe overnight it's not going to develop a cure for cancer, but in the long run perhaps have a larger impact on health by preventing cancer. And you know, as an investigator that's been before some of those, I can tell you, and has served on those, it's very tough sometimes to get that prevention message across, where, you know, so many of the researchers, what they're really interested in doing is sequencing DNA in tumors and using some of these cool new technologies to do genomics.
And I have to mention, so when you do something like you sequence DNA in a tumor, you're looking at the result. You're not learning about the cause. And I really think that we have to try to understand what causes to begin with.
We have a little culture to change here too, right? Because
yes.
how much of the money that's gone into cancer research has gone into the disease and to the treatment or the cure versus the prevention? And how much of the messaging that goes to the public is about prevention?
Well, if that's what you invest in and that's what you report on, you just continue that dialogue. So if you've got, you know, 10%, maybe 15% total dollars spent on the whole breast cancer prevention environment, and that includes a broad scope of it, it's not equal to what's being spent on basic biology and what's being spent on treatment.
So Florence, back to you and the whole journalist thing. You've written this remarkable book, which I commend to everybody in the room. And you've heard this conversation and seen this report. What do you know, if you were writing the story, if you were writing, you know, that either the magazine piece or the front page story, what would you be writing right now? New evidence, new agenda?
Well, I think an interesting component of the story that's really not told often enough has to do, no offense, Linda, but the regulatory agencies, it's not Linda's fault, are just not in the 21st century. They're just not caught up to this level of science. And I think that's got to change. And I think there should be more journalism pointing this out. There should be more reporting about it. I think most people have no idea that the substances in their shampoos have never been tested. And they have no idea that the regulatory agencies that oversee these chemicals...
That should be on the label. Right? Kind of like it is on vitamins and stuff. It says, this may or may not work, but go have fun.
Right.
But I mean, if you're washing your hair and, oh, this smells good, and it says, nothing in this bottle has ever been tested.
That's a good point. I mean, so Frank, have you ever been in California? They have these labels warning this product contains a substance that is known by the state of California to possibly cause cancer or reproductive hazards, right? But have you ever seen on a label, warning, this product contains substances that have never been tested?
No.
You never see
No,
that.
well, you walk into a parking garage in California and see that sign. I mean, you drive in and you think, well, do I not leave my car? What do I do, you know?
People just have, the general public, I think, has no idea that that's the reality. And they don't know that the regulatory agencies also have very little sort of teeth, really.
I'm going to leave you all now, not because I want to, but because I want to bring the microphone down. And Conn, if I can start with you, since you started us off here with Nabby Adams with such an unbelievably dramatic story from 200 years ago, and then you observed that 200 years is present day in some places. I'm just curious, is your observation and whether you have a question for anybody on the panel?
As an observation, I think we are with breast cancer at a moment not unlike the publication of The Jungle by Upton Sinclair in the first decade of the 20th century. You have to our job is to peel away layers upon layers of secret, layers upon layers of duplicity, and have to make of this a common cause among people from all walks of life. It cannot be a nerd's cause. And it's our job to broaden it, to make it a popular movement.
No one in this room is a nerd.
No, I wouldn't think of it. Sorry, I don't see any.
Any question for anybody on the panel? Otherwise, I'll move on.
No, the heck with it. They're great.
Oh, let me come up. Melissa.
Hi, Melissa Perry. I'm the chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health here in the School of Public Health and Health Services at GW. And I'm wondering if the panel can address a overarching issue known as doubt and uncertainty. And that seems to keep the public paralyzed. It keeps we as researchers and scientists paralyzed. It also, well, there's a professor in my department who, tenured professor in my department who is the current director of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, who wrote an interesting book with a very provocative title called Doubt is Their Product, which is targeted at industry, which keeps industry being able to manufacture products that keep us all uncertain as to what the impacts are. So I'm wondering if you as panelists could talk about the role of uncertainty and how it stymies our ability to push decisive action.
I'll take that first. And thank you for mentioning David's book, because that's David Michaels, who is the head of OSHA, and I was going to mention it, Melissa, if you hadn't. I think the point is that somehow people think scientists know it all. And the answer is we don't. We never know it all. There is always some uncertainty. The more you learn, the more you'd like to learn and the more you'd want to know. But there becomes a point where there's enough information that you need to act. So there's something which has been mischaracterized in this country called the precautionary principle, which in this country people think it means that you act in the absence of any information. But in fact, what the precautionary principle says is you act in the presence of concerning information, even in the absence of certainty. So I think that we need to be moving in that direction, because sometimes if you don't act, do we really want to wait to the point that we have dead bodies?
It gets into the way the laws are written, unfortunately, as well. And so in the case of pesticides, the law was rewritten in the late 90s. It said, if you're going to allow pesticides in food, EPA, you have to determine that you're reasonably certain there's no harm. Reasonably certain there's no harm. On the other hand, when EPA is allowing a toxic chemical, then the standard is a standard of unreasonable risk. A standard of unreasonable risk, which has been interpreted by the courts to say that actually, before EPA, bans even one use, much less ban the whole chemical, and I would argue very rarely do you have to ban the entire chemical, like extirpate it from the face of the earth to be satisfied that you're dealing with risk. But they have to show that they have analyzed thoroughly every possible alternative approach to controlling that. And that caused EPA to not even be able to ban asbestos, which is amazing. And so I think that there's a need for the law to be changed. And of course, I've been saying that for a number of years. And I know there are a lot of people in the room who agree with me. But I think that could make an enormous difference, because if the balance were tilted such that uncertainty weighed in favor of the public's health, then we could live with it. But the way it's tilted, uncertainty weighs in favor of the chemical. And what we don't know definitely can hurt us, and that's a problem in terms of the public's health.
I'll go to another question here, but before I do, how many students do we have in the room? Okay, you have all declared yourselves. You can run, but you cannot hide. Students have to ask questions. One of you is up next. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. This has been a fascinating conversation, and clearly the role of chemicals and our exposure to chemicals in the environment and the relationship to increased risk of breast cancer is playing a very prominent role in this conversation. So I wanted to ask you about chemicals. Florence studies them. Lynn used to regulate them. Linda is responsible for researching them. Jeannie's involved in advocating for the stricter regulation of them. I want to know, where does the chemical industry play in this conversation?
Great question.
Well, of course, they have a huge role, and I think Jeannie mentioned that, and that at times they seem like they're willing to come to the table. I mean, just 2 years ago, the chemical industry was in a policy position where they were saying, this Toxic Substances Control Act should be reformed. We have principles for the reform of it. And then they reversed on that. And many of us feel they did that because of the situation in Congress and the partisanship. And I think that Conn Nugent is onto something here with the need to find ways of pulling the two political parties together on some of these things, as long as there is this split where, and this is what's happened with reforming the chemicals law. Not a single Republican in the House of Representatives or in the Senate has been willing to say they're going to sign on to such an effort. And why, I don't know, because we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, you do, because regulation equals impediments to business, right? That's the general political perception.
That's really not true.
Except the customers.
What's that?
The customers of the chemical industry are businesses, and they are hurt. They are hurt by these uncertainties. If something unexpected is happening with something in a baby bottle, yeah, the people that made the bisphenol A are hurt, but also the people who manufacture baby bottles are hurt, and all kinds of other people. The retailers are hurt. All kinds of people are hurt, and so you have. It is not just a simple thing of the economy versus the environment, because there are many actors in the economy. Not all of them are chemical manufacturers.
So, Lynn, in many cases, the manufacturers of the products are actually interested in working with safe chemicals. And so this is the whole movement that someone mentioned related to green chemistry, where you design products with an absence of toxicity in the design of the product. So, for example, what has driven actually the removal of some flame retardants, believe me, there are others, but some flame retardants, was the fact that there was enough data that was generated that people, moms and others, got active and started to force the agenda. So the states got active, and the states banned regulations, and then the producer of the chemicals, well, I should say not only the states, but the manufacturers who were using these chemicals started saying, we don't want to use something that people are telling us is bad. And so all this pressure built up to the original producer of the chemical, and they decided to withdraw the chemical from the market. So it's the marketplace pressure which actually gets things happening. But it is not true that regulations actually cost more money. In the long run, we know, for example, with air pollution, that in the short run there may be an expensive cost, but within a relatively short period of time after that, the regulations actually lead to new jobs, new products, new approaches, and making money.
We just need more science in politics, and we'll do fine. Your question, you're a student?
Yeah, my name is Amanda Castroverdi. I'm an SMPA alum and current graduate student here.
Graduate student in?
SMPA.
You have to translate this.
Media and Public Affairs.
Okay.
The building we're standing in.
Small commercial.
I often find myself struggling with wanting to support these larger mainstream organizations like Susan G. Komen, but then having really large qualms and problems with the culture that surrounds the movements and kind of this idea of pink washing that happens in these movements and these events. And I just want to know what your opinion is of products that contain these chemicals and these carcinogens that, stamp a pink ribbon on their bottle or their packaging, and kind of what are the implications of this disconnect between these larger movements and the lack of promotion of what you're urging of prioritizing prevention.
Do we have great students here, or
I'll
what?
start that one, being
Fabulous question.
the people who participate come from the heart, and they come from really wanting to do something meaningful and important, and often are survivors or friends or family. So I think that there's tremendous sense of wanting community in a lot of the bigger events and the bigger activities that go on. I think people who are drawn to that need to communicate what their values are up the chain. People need to communicate to us. Do we resonate with your values? Communicate to the organizations that you want to be supportive of. We're how you take money. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these questions are going to profitability of companies, or going to marketing, or going to, there's a resource, obviously. People engaged in breast cancer are a good target market right, for selling things. And I think we can make the decisions as to what we want to buy and communicate about that. So, I mean, those are individual decisions about what values do you hold most importantly and most dear when you decide where you're going to put your social justice time, your engagement in public welfare and public health. So you can't make an individual decision, but I think you just have to look at the values of and see if it resonates for you. Can you support that?
Florence, I'm wondering if you have a thought on that, in this question.
Well, there are a couple of good books that have looked into the idea of greenwashing, or pinkwashing, I should say, similar to greenwashing. And they've looked at sort of the money chain, as a lot of good journalism does. Who is supporting some of these organizations? What are their interests in supporting them? So, I think if you're interested in pursuing it, I think there's some great work out there about it.
Okay, another question. I'm coming over here. This lady. See, I'm getting my exercise. This is good. Stand up, please.
Sure.
Really great panel. Thank you, everyone. My name is Laura McCleary. I blog about environmental health issues at laurasrules.org. I've been writing a lot about flame retardants and sofas.
You've been tweeting through our conversation?
I have not been live tweeting because I can't take notes and live tweet at the same time.
Okay.
I'm not that multitasking skilled. I wanted to ask a question about whether it's possible that obesity, as described as a risk factor by you guys, is also in need of a kind of environmental health paradigm shift. And when we talk about it as a risk factor in this very inert way, we risk kind of missing the forest for the trees, because why are Americans so much fatter than Europeans, for example? BPA we know is linked to obesity. There hasn't been a ton of work looking at windows of exposure and epigenetics on that front. And so when you think about who's fatter, you think about socioeconomic classes, you think about very degraded, cheap calories that are packaged in plastics, where there's a lot of chemicals in the industrial food system. And I wanted to sort of raise the issue because I think it's important to, when we're doing this kind of amazing work, really breaking through on a new paradigm, to really think about what are we saying about some of the risk factors, and should we think about obesity in this more complicated way as well?
Thank you.
The simple answer is absolutely. We know, for example, first of all, I'm not going to give anyone a buy and say you don't have to exercise and you can eat as many Twinkies. They're not being made anymore, right? But you can, as many donuts as you want. That's not the case. But there's growing evidence that some of these environmental chemicals, in fact, predispose to obesity. And there's growing evidence that there are, like during development, during early life stages, is an especially sensitive time. And you're basically resetting your biological, your physiology, so that it's going to be much harder for you to control your weight. So there's evidence not only, for example, for BPA, there's evidence for, well, we know that if mom smokes when she's pregnant, that's really bad for her baby. Not only is the baby going to be small, likely to be small when they're born, we know there might be some effects on their neurodevelopment, but we also know now that by the age of 10, those kids are at much greater risk of being obese and overweight. We know that obesity is associated with type 2 diabetes, which we also know is really a bad disease. And I have a good friend who's a pediatric endocrinologist, and she tells me that when she was training 30 years ago, she never saw a child with type 2 diabetes, and now that is practically all she sees in her practice are kids with type 2 diabetes. So I think we need to begin to ask the question. We have lots of data from animal studies now. We have evidence that some of the DDTs, that some of the other persistent kinds of pollutants, we have data that arsenic, we have data that some of the metallic compounds are all associated with increase in obesity. So I think that's a really great question, and we have to be careful not to blame the person. This may not all be their fault.
And to that point, we don't have the kinds of environmental health questions when you go into your primary care talk to your pediatrician. You have a newborn baby, and we're not asking the kinds of questions and collecting the kind of data that we would understand better. I mean, clinicians are talking about this all over them. How do they do that? How do you assess what exposures might have been? And when you see suddenly a 7, 8, 9-year-old girl with breast buds, or you're seeing, you know, this underweight infant become an obese 10-year-old, what could that mean? And how can you assess that? And what can we do about it? How can we intervene instead of saying, stop eating or go exercise or whatever it is? So I think this is all part of that shift. We have to collect the data. We have to be conscious of this. We have to get this into clinical practice.
I keep hearing you say we have to collect the data. How long does it take to collect the data?
I don't know, 20 minutes? Let's just go out and do it, you know. No, but I mean, I think it has to be part of how we think.
But my point is, and I think her question prompted a fascinating answer, we actually suspect a lot, but we know a lot.
Yeah.
And yet, if you were to go out on the street and talk to people, I wonder how much of this would be reflected in their everyday knowledge. So I'm wondering whether we're communicating a lot and connecting with the public.
No, we have, right, we're not doing enough of that.
Okay. That's a subject for another conversation.
Yeah, that is. We could have another panel, E4, communication.
I'm Arnie Schwartz. I'm a pathologist here at GW. In a sense, I think it's important to talk about some of these chemicals in the environment. In fact, I'm doing research on some of that. But I think the most dangerous chemical in our environment that we have today, which I was hoping to have more discussion on, is cigarette smoke. And I think cigarette smoke is probably the most dangerous thing for women in the United States, not only in terms of lung cancer and bladder cancer and so forth, but even there's been evidence to show that there is a real but mild component of cigarette smoke related to breast cancer. So what I would emphasize is that sometimes we need to put the subject into a certain perspective. I think these chemicals are concerning. I think we have to investigate them. But we have one chemical in the environment that we know a lot about, and that's smoking. And I would then turn to Ms. Williams and say, the next article you're going to write is that cigarettes are dangerous to your breast.
I mean, I would agree, except that, you know, cigarette smoke is not one chemical. It's a mixture of chemicals. And
it's a social habit.
It's a social habit, but it's also something that obviously some people are exposed to because of their jobs, not because they smoke, but because they're in places where other people smoke. And we're making a lot of progress, including GW going smoke-free this fall. I wanted to be sure to mention that, which I think is very important.
What percentage of women in America smoke? Do we know?
About 20%.
20% of women.
And so, in a sense, we need to say...
1 out of 5.
Yeah, and it's younger women, and that's the really big. They smoke...
Linda, we've been smoke-free in our buildings for a long time, but we are going to a smoke-free campus, which is a much more profound change,
I don't know about
especially in an urban environment.
If I
like
see
this.
one of our students smoking or something, I want to go up and grab them and say, what are you doing? All right, question? Yes. And then somebody, I'm coming to the back, and because of the time, that's going to have to be the last one, so you get to be the second to last one.
Very, very quick. Thank you all very much. My name is Anita McBride. I'm at the School of Public Affairs at American University.
It's all right. We welcome the enemy here, too.
But this has been fascinating, and I just have a question that I want to be sure I was clear on what I saw in Dr. Birnbaum in your terrific presentation. But most cases of breast cancer occur with no family history. Is that no family history of breast cancer or no family history of cancers?
It's most family history of breast cancer. You know, and I think we might ask the question, you know, maybe one person gets breast cancer and someone else gets liver cancer and someone else gets lung cancer. Are there underlying causes that may trigger each? Because at different times in our life, you may be differentially susceptible to different chemicals. And that's something, you know, for 50 years, the tobacco industry was able to block regulations on smoking because they would say, only 11% of people who smoke get cancer, so obviously smoking doesn't cause cancer. But we have to understand some people, some organs, some tissue is going to be susceptible, and some are not at a given stage of your life.
Last question from the audience here, sir. Stand up and let us know who you are.
Hi, Richard Dennison, Environmental Defense Fund. Thanks for a great panel. I just wanted to ask this group here of panelists why it is that prevention seems to be such a hard sell in environmental health issues. And I want to throw out a hypothesis, but and that is that it's kind of an orphan between a practice of medicine that has failed to account for the environment and a practice of environmental protection that's failed to account for health. And I wondered if you all might have reactions to that.
I think we've tested that hypothesis and it's been proven true. I think we're living that. I mean, I think that's a quick answer, but I think, you know, environmental health as a movement is relatively young. And, you know, really public health was, you know, it belongs in public health. I like to think of it as environmental public health. Environmentalists are coming to health. Health people are coming to the environment, but as a movement, if you will, and into medical practice, you know, you say environmental health to some people, and they're not even really understanding what we mean. So,
I think one of the issues is when we're dealing with medicine, if we're dealing with treatment and cures, you can see an effect in an individual person and an individual subject. When you're dealing with environmental health, you're looking at a population. So I often use the example, Jeanne, if you hadn't had a lot of lead when you were little, you'd have 5 more IQ points. That's not something we can ever prove or disprove. But we can look at a population and see a population shift. And that is true with what we're looking at when we're talking about environmental health. And that's a much harder thing for people to understand than the fact that they know if they take a drug, it made them feel better.
All right, we're going to conclude, but I want to do, are you up for playing a little game on the way out?
if I can say one last thing before, can I?
Well, I'm going to let you say one last thing as part of the game.
I get to say one thing, okay.
Well, go ahead. Maybe I'll let you sneak it in.
I want to just recognize and thank my staff who are here today, and I'm going to ask them to stand up. And there's one person in particular that I didn't call out that I need to have her stand up because she worked by my side on the iBezirk report, and that's Dr. Connie Engel. And I just please thank my team for it takes a village, and I've got an incredible staff here that are committed to this, and I just I want to recognize them.
Okay,
so thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations to all of you. Here's the game.
Yeah, okay.
Here's the game.
It. Okay.
All right? They don't know this is coming. I really don't know where this is going, but we'll do it anyway.
Okay.
It's Valentine's Day.
Yes.
You could take a Valentine to anybody on the planet to advance this cause. Who would you take it to, and what would you tell them?
If I could take the Valentine to anybody on the planet, you should go first.
Oh, no. You already started talking, sorry.
Come on, Jeanne.
Michelle Obama.
And what would you tell her?
I would tell her that women's health, children's health, her concerns about that, you know, she's got an organic garden there at the White House. I would like her to embrace this prevention. She's got 2 young girls. I'm sure she cares about them same way I care about my granddaughters.
Powerful bully pulpit, right?
Powerful.
Okay. Florence?
Oh, now me. Well, maybe the Surgeon General, because I think that Mr. Dennison's point was a good one, that environmental health is not recognized really by the medical establishment at this point. And there was recently a study showing, I think it was asking obstetricians, how many of you talk to your patients about environmental exposures? And it was something like 18% of them bring it up. And this is not something that's taught in medical schools. And because our doctors talk to us about seatbelts and about soda and about smoking, then we become educated to some degree through our doctors. So I'd like to see it penetrate the medical community more than it has.
Linda?
Well, I'm a little bit with Jeanne because I was thinking of the president, and for him to make that one of the things that he would really call out, like he did certain other things like climate change, for example, in his State of the Nation talk just the other day.
Dean Goldman, you get the last Valentine.
Right, I'm going to be very contrary here. I'm going to send my Valentine to Boehner, Speaker Boehner, and I'm going to say, I don't hate you, I love you. And I know that you're a human being that has a family and that you care about them, and you also care a lot about the cost of health care. And I think the most effective way of lowering those costs would be to focus on prevention. We're spending a lot of money on health care that we shouldn't be, and people are suffering, and they needn't be. And let's get together and do something about that. I don't expect him to go out with me, but you know.
But in the spirit of the day. Well, this has been an amazing conversation and an important one. I really, really hope that the new evidence drives the new agenda. We really should have another conversation about how you do that through public communication and effective communication at all levels, because this is something that must not just be a report that prompts a discussion like this and everybody pats themselves on the back and works the corridors of power and the research community and doesn't engage the public. Because at the end of the day, it's when the public says, you know, my water is polluted, my babies are dying, or I'm in danger, that's when it becomes unavoidable. That's when it becomes compelling. And that's really when we all become people and we don't become parties, when we're in it at that level. So thank you all very much. Thanks to all of you.